Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Audio Classic Detective, your home for refined mystery and masterful deduction. Here we revive the golden age of crime fiction where every motive is masked, every alibi tested, and only the keenest minds prevail. So settle in, brew a proper cup of tea, and prepare for clever crimes and even cleverer solutions. The investigation is about to begin. It was not every day that Miss Marple received a formal invitation, embossed with gold lettering and smelling faintly of lavender water. The envelope, addressed in a hand both elegant and trembling with age, arrived with the second post. Inside, the words were carefully chosen: an invitation to a charity garden party at Hawthorne Hall, the grandest and most storied house in the district. Miss Marple held the card between her fingers, tapping it gently against the edge of the tea table. It was curious, this sudden overture from Lady Harrowby, a woman she had only encountered in passing, and one who had, by all accounts, little interest in village gatherings. Miss Marple's curiosity, always as sharp as her knitting needles, pricked at the edges of her mind. Why her? Why now? Of course, curiosity was not suspicion. Not yet. But over the years, Miss Marple had learned one thing, with absolute certainty. When one is invited somewhere unexpectedly, it is rarely for the pleasure of one's company, alone. The gravel drive crunched beneath the wheels of the hired motor car as Miss Marple approached Hawthorne Hall for the first time in many years. She remembered it from her youth. A gleaming house, its windows polished like mirrors, its gardens bursting with delphiniums and foxgloves. But time, she saw, had not been kind. The windows were dull, the glass smudged as if no hand had cared to wipe them clean. Creeping ivy, once a decorative touch, had swallowed entire sections of the east wing. The great stone steps leading to the entrance were uneven, weathered by years of rain and neglect. Yet for all its decline there was dignity still, a sort of defiant pride clinging to the bones of the place. Miss Marple stepped out of the car, her gloved hand lingering for a moment on the iron railing, cold beneath her fingers. One did not have to be a detective to see that Hawthorne Hall had secrets, but perhaps it took someone of Miss Marple's particular temperament to sense that the house was waiting for something or someone to disturb them. The Harrowbys, when they greeted her, were as faded as the house itself, dressed in clothes a touch too formal for the occasion, and speaking with the careful politeness of people who guard their words as closely as their silver. Lady Harrowby, tall and angular, wore a string of pearls that might have been real once, but now had the suspicious sheen of paste. Her son Richard seemed far too preoccupied with watching the guests to engage in proper conversation, his eyes flicking toward the housekeeper, whose downcast gaze suggested she knew far more than she ever intended to say. There was friction in the air, subtle yet unmistakable, the kind that lingers between siblings nursing old resentments or in-laws forced into uneasy proximity. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her cup of tea, observed it all. Not with judgment, but with the serene acceptance that families, after all, were the most fascinating of creatures. Conversation, as it does at these sorts of gatherings, eventually turned to the house itself. Someone, Miss Marple could not say who first, mentioned the sealed room, that peculiar feature of Hawthorne Hall, spoken of in hushed tones in the village for as long as anyone could remember. It was a foolish story, of course. Or so said Lady Harrowby, her laugh too brittle, her smile too forced. A room locked for generations, its key misplaced or deliberately destroyed, depending on which version of the tale one believed. Some said it was sealed to hide a scandal. Others claimed it was a precaution against a curse. But what interested Miss Marple most was not the story itself, but the reaction it provoked. Lady Harrowby's knuckles whitening against the porcelain of her teacup, Richard's quick glance at the housekeeper, and the housekeeper's gaze fixed firmly on the ground. It was the reaction, more than the tale, that told Miss Marple all she needed to know. The sealed room was no mere legend. It was a wound, and wounds, if left untreated, had a habit of filling the air with the scent of something far worse than decay. As the garden party unfolded around her, with laughter and music drifting across the lawn, Miss Marple could not quite shake the sense that the house itself was listening. Every step across the gravel, every clink of china, seemed to echo just a little too loudly. As if the walls held their breath, there was something beneath the surface. Not just family tension, but the weight of something long buried, something that had been waiting, patient and silent, for the right moment to rise once more. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, allowing herself the smallest of smiles. This, after all, was exactly why she had come. Not for the roses or the ribbons or the raffle prizes, but for that sense, the unmistakable scent of a secret too large to remain hidden much longer. It began, as such things often do, with something seemingly innocent. The younger guests, children too restless to be confined to polite conversation, had been playing a haphazard game of hide-and-seek, darting between doorways and pressing themselves into alcoves, where the wallpaper peeled and the plaster gave way under curious fingers. One small boy, no more than 7, found himself wedged between a mahogany sideboard and the wall of the west corridor. With the earnest determination only children possess, he pressed his weight against the wooden paneling, leaning and shifting, until, with the faintest sigh of ancient hinges, the wall itself gave way, swinging inward just an inch or two. The children gasped, one after another, until a ripple of whispers reached the adults gathered in the hall below. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, heard it too. That subtle change in atmosphere, the sudden hush that comes when something out of the ordinary interrupts the expected flow of an afternoon. She rose without fuss, her expression as mild as ever, and followed the curious crowd now gathering at the foot of the west staircase, where the loose panel waited, half ajar, like a mouth that had held its breath too long. The passageway was narrow and airless, its floorboards so thick with dust that each footstep left a ghostly imprint. The walls pressed close, lined with wooden beams that had shifted and settled over generations, bending slightly, as if the house itself had curled inward to keep its secrets hidden. Miss Marple allowed the younger guests to lead the way, their chatter bright with nervous excitement, until the corridor gave way to a low, arched doorway, its frame marked with an ornate brass handle, tarnished to a dull green. The door resisted at first, wood swollen with damp, reluctant to surrender. But curiosity, it seemed, was a force stronger than time itself. The door gave a final groan and swung inward, revealing a room frozen in time. Cobwebs veiled the corners, and the air carried a faint metallic tang, as though the room itself had bled memory into the very walls. A faded rug lay crumpled near the hearth, and the window shutters, nailed shut from within, filtered sunlight into slender, trembling slivers. The guests stood uncertainly at the threshold, half thrilled, half uneasy, but Miss Marple stepped forward without hesitation. The house, after all, had wanted this room found, and now that it had given up its secret, the only question left was why. Against the far wall, under a fine film of dust and mildew, stood a trunk, leather-bound, its brass hinges dulled with verdigris, but unmistakably significant. There was a sense about it, as though the trunk itself had been waiting to be opened, held fast by time and silence. Richard Harrowby stepped forward, eager to prove himself useful. The lock was rusted but weak, and after only a moment's struggle, the lid creaked open, releasing a breath of stale air, thick with damp paper, rotting leather, and a scent oddly reminiscent of dried lavender. Within lay a jumble of relics, each item a fragment of a life once lived and long forgotten. There were letters, their ink faded to sepia, tied in bundles with fraying ribbon. A string of pearls, knotted and cracked, nestled beside a man's pocket watch, stopped at a meaningless hour. And then, almost carelessly, discarded at the bottom, was a leather-bound book, its cover darkened with age, the edges curling inward like burned paper. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over it for just a moment, before she reached in and lifted it free. There was a weight to the book, not of the pages themselves, but of what they contained. Secrets pressed between its covers like flowers laid to dry, long dead, but never forgotten. As the room stirred with speculation, Miss Marple stood quietly, turning the book over in her hands. Something in the air shifted, though no one else seemed to notice. But Miss Marple noticed. She always noticed. It was Lady Harrowby who broke the silence first. Her hand, already unsteady on her son's arm, flew suddenly to her throat, as though the very air had thickened around her. Her gaze fixed upon the trunk, not with curiosity, nor with the polite interest one might expect at such a discovery, but with something closer to recognition. Miss Marple, who had long believed that surprise rarely caused fainting in healthy women, observed the sequence with quiet interest. The widening of the eyes, the involuntary backward step, the sudden loss of color, all too immediate, too instinctive to be mere shock. This was not simply the discovery of a trunk. It was the recognition of something within it, something that should have stayed hidden. Without so much as a word, Lady Harrowby swayed, her grip slipping from Richard's arm, and crumpled gracefully to the floor. The guests, torn between sympathy and morbid curiosity, fluttered around her. Richard barked orders: water, salts, air. But Miss Marple remained where she stood, her gaze drifting back to the trunk, where a single scrap of fabric, discolored and fragile with age, lay curled beneath a bundle of letters. It was hardly noticeable, unless one knew exactly what to look for. The fainting spell, dramatic though it was, served a greater purpose. It drew attention away from the others in the room. Miss Marple's eyes moved gently across the gathering, noticing what no one else saw. One guest, a distant cousin by marriage, had stepped closer to the trunk, his fingers twitching at his sides, as though resisting the urge to reach in and claim something. Another, the housekeeper, stood rigid, her face turned away, but her shoulders so tense they quivered beneath the sensible black of her dress. And Richard himself, standing too still. The kind of stillness that speaks of careful control, not natural calm. It was human nature at its most unvarnished. Fear, greed, and memory wrestled silently in the space between the letters and the pearls, and each guest, some openly, some in secret, seemed to see not a trunk, but a threat. Miss Marple's hands remained folded neatly before her, but within her mind the pieces were already shifting, arranging themselves into the first faint outline of a pattern. It was only as the guests turned to leave, Lady Harrowby revived enough to be led back toward the hall, that one of the children, lingering at the edge of the group, pointed a finger toward the floor. The corridor, dim in the afternoon light, revealed a thin, wet smear, bright against the ancient floorboards, a stain too fresh to belong to any ghost of the past. Miss Marple said nothing, but her gaze lingered just a moment longer than necessary. Someone had been here very recently, and they had left more than footprints behind. It was the maid, arriving early to dust and set the morning fires, who first noticed the door to the library standing slightly ajar. That, in itself, was unusual. The library at Hawthorne Hall was rarely left unattended, and certainly not overnight. She hesitated, one hand hovering near the doorframe, before stepping inside. And there, in the high-backed chair beside the fireplace, slumped at an unnatural angle, was body. The scarf was what drew the eye first, an antique length of Harrowby silk, its pattern unmistakable to anyone familiar with the family's legacy. It was twisted tightly around the victim's throat, the silk pulled taut, leaving an angry band where life had been cruelly choked away. The victim's hands hung limp, one wrist grazing the edge of the writing desk, where an overturned cup had left a dark stain across a forgotten sheet of paper. The maid's scream was brief, cut short by her own horror, and by the time the others came running, her voice was little more than a shaken whisper, repeating over and over, "The curse. The curse has come true." The house awakened not gradually, but violently, as word of the death spread from room to room. Dressing gowns were hastily thrown over nightclothes, feet hurried down staircases that had stood silent for decades, and expressions ranged from genuine horror to something far more complex. Lady Harrowby trembled at the foot of the stairs, clutching the banister as though the house itself had turned against her. Richard's face was pale, though his hands, Miss Marple noted, remained strangely still. The servants whispered among themselves, muttering of the Harrowby curse, of rooms best left sealed, and of secrets that had waited too long to be disturbed. But Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting untouched, knew that houses did not kill people. People did. And it was in the space between fear and performance that the truth would begin to show itself. She had always believed that the moments immediately after her death were the most revealing. Before grief settled into habit and alibis were polished to a shine, people's first reactions, raw, unguarded, spoke volumes. Lady Harrowby's distress was expected, but there was something too rehearsed in the fluttering hands and gasping breaths, as though she knew exactly how much emotion ought to be shown. Richard, by contrast, stood too stiffly, saying too little, a man with something to conceal, or too stunned to process his own guilt. The guests, gathered awkwardly in the hall, divided themselves into familiar camps, the horrified, the curious, and the quietly calculating. One guest had already positioned himself near the door, ready to slip away if need be. Another avoided Miss Marple's gaze entirely, her fingers twisting at the hem of her sleeve. It was, Miss Marple thought, exactly what one might expect when a family secret grows too heavy to carry. Sooner or later someone must collapse beneath the weight. It was a housemaid, the same who had discovered the body, who made the second discovery. The trunk, still sitting open in the secret room, had been disturbed once more. And this time, something was missing. A brooch, once belonging to Lady Harrowby's great-aunt, a piece of considerable value, had vanished, almost as though the murder itself had been a cover for theft, or so some were quick to suggest. Miss Marple listened to the theory with a small, polite smile, filing it neatly away in the drawer of her mind marked, "Too convenient." The theft, if it had even occurred, was an afterthought, a distraction planted like a seed in fertile ground, A real theft would have taken more than a single piece, and a real thief would have had no reason to leave blood on the floor. No, Miss Marple suspected. The brooch was only the beginning, a small thread leading back to something far more dangerous. Breakfast at Hawthorne Hall, on that particular morning, was a strained affair. Conversation drifted between half-hearted condolences and carefully worded speculations, each guest measuring how much to say against how much to keep hidden. Old feuds resurfaced in coded remarks, polite jabs cloaked in the language of civility. Finances were mentioned obliquely, with veiled references to debts owed and inheritances awaited. Miss Marple ate precisely half a slice of toast, her attention not on the food, but on the silences between the words. It was often in what people chose not to say that the greatest revelations lay. By the time the coffee had cooled, she had assembled the first corner of the puzzle, a tapestry of resentments, desperation, and opportunity, woven not overnight, but over generations. Later, alone in the small parlor where the Morning Post lay unopened, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. A person might strangle out of passion, or panic, or even greed. But to use an heirloom silk scarf, one so distinctly tied to family history, that was a choice made deliberately. This was no ordinary murder. This was an echo, a whisper from the past, a hand reaching from some long-forgotten tragedy to shape the present. And Miss Marple, with her tidy mind and unerring memory for human frailty, knew that such echoes rarely ended with just one death. The villagers, Miss Marple had long observed, had a particular talent for keeping both secrets and stories alive, sometimes without knowing where one ended and the other began. She found them in their usual places: the retired postmistress in her sunny parlor, the former housekeeper to the vicar with her half-mended knitting. Neither had set foot in Hawthorne Hall for decades, yet both spoke of it as if the dust beneath its floorboards were still beneath their feet. The tales came in fits and starts, tangled in half-truths and embroidered memories. There were whispers of a scandal, a quarrel so fierce it cracked the very foundation of the family, and a room sealed not to preserve the past, but to bury it. One spoke of letters burned in the grate, the other of midnight sobs heard through the walls, but neither could agree whether the ghost that walked the west wing belonged to a spurned lover, a betrayed child, or a murdered heir. Miss Marple said very little. She simply listened, knowing that between fact and embellishment, there was always a thread of truth, and all she had to do was follow it. It had been the youngest daughter, of course. It almost always was. A Harrowby girl, wild-hearted and headstrong, who had fallen hopelessly in love with a man her family could never approve. He was a gardener's son, or a visiting artist, or perhaps even a coachman. The precise details shifted with each retelling. What never changed, however, was the consequence. The girl disappeared into the night, leaving only a note pinned to her pillow. Some said she was disowned, others believed she was lured back and locked away, but all agreed that the elopement splintered the family into factions: loyalists, deniers, and those who quietly rejoiced at her disgrace. As for the heir, the child born of that forbidden union, their fate had vanished into silence, a silence so profound it suggested deliberate erasure. The hall had swallowed the scandal, brick by brick, but Miss Marple knew better than to believe time ever buried anything completely. No story about Hawthorne Hall was ever told without mention of the curse, that any who dared enter the sealed room would find themselves haunted, ruined, or worse. The villagers spoke of maids struck mute, of footmen who vanished overnight, and of a butler who hanged himself after just one glimpse beyond the door. Miss Marple, who had a deep respect for the imaginative powers of rural gossip, allowed them their ghost stories, but her interest lay elsewhere. To her mind, curses were useful things, not for the supernatural fear they inspired, but for the very real fear they concealed. It was far more practical, after all, to invent a vengeful spirit than to explain why certain papers had gone missing, why a door had been hastily bricked up, or why a particular family member had left the house under cover of darkness, never to return. Curses, she reflected, were excellent camouflage for human guilt. At the vicarage, where old papers were kept for want of anywhere else to put them, Miss Marple found exactly what she had been looking for. The diary of a long-dead parlor maid, written in uneven nervous script, recorded the dull rhythms of household life. Laundry days, unexpected visitors, deliveries from the butcher. But between the ordinary entries were fragments of something darker. She cried all night. The girl had written one October evening, without explanation of who she was. Another entry months later simply read, "I saw him carry something into the room after midnight. It was wrapped in a cloth. He told me to forget it." And finally, a single line scrawled near the diary's end. "It's still in there." "I know it is." Miss Marple closed the book gently, her fingers resting for a moment on the worn leather cover. She had not yet solved the puzzle, but she could now see its shape, and it was far more sinister than a lover's quarrel or a family feud. As Miss Marple walked back toward Hawthorne Hall, her mind stitched the old stories together, piece by piece. A missing heir, a sealed room, a family curse, and now a murder in the present day. None of these were isolated threads. They were parts of the same tapestry, woven so tightly that to pull one loose might cause the entire fabric to unravel. The past, she knew, was never truly past, especially in places like Hawthorne Hall, where the very walls held memory like a stain. Someone, somewhere within the house, had spent their life keeping the secrets buried, and now, with the room unsealed and the trunk uncovered, they had been forced to act, desperately, violently, to keep those secrets from seeing daylight. Miss Marple did not yet know who, or precisely why, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever had begun all those years ago was not finished yet. Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and impeccable sense of timing, suggested tea in the drawing room. It was not a demand, nor even a request, merely a gentle observation that a little calm might do everyone good after such a distressing morning. And so, by quiet force of personality alone, the principal players were gathered, porcelain cups trembling faintly in their sources, the atmosphere brittle and stretched thin. She asked nothing of consequence. What fine weather they were having. How lovely the garden might look if the old fountain were restored. How curious, she remarked, that houses had such memories. Walls that seemed to listen, even after all those who built them were long gone. By the time the third cup was poured, the barriers began to slip. Politeness gave way to small frictions, and before long, the truth began to ripple just beneath the surface. Lady Harrowby sat stiff-backed, her fingers resting far too lightly on her cup, as though it might burn her if she held it too firmly. Miss Marple asked nothing direct, but her innocent musings about the upkeep of such a grand house drew a weary sigh from Lady Harrowby's thin lips. The house, she admitted, was a burden she could no longer bear. The costs were ruinous, the repairs endless, and with each year the family fortune thinned like worn linen. Selling was the only sensible course, if only the matter of certain legal complications could be settled. Her smile when she spoke of legal complications was far too tight. Miss Marple had seen that smile before, on women who had signed papers they never dared to read, and on those who knew that the past never truly sells with the house. It lingers, unpaid, in the very bricks. The trunk, it seemed, contained more than old letters and broken pearls. It held the very key to the estate's future, a key Lady Harrowby had hoped would remain lost. Richard Harrowby was less adept at disguising his tension. His hands, restless and fidgeting, betrayed him at every turn. Miss Marple's gentle observation, "How fortunate it must be for a son to inherit such a legacy," drew only a tight laugh. Fortune, it seemed, had not favored Richard. His debts, whispered of in village corners, were substantial. Cards, horses, and business ventures doomed from the outset had drained his finances to the bone. The house, crumbling though it was, represented his only chance at solvency, provided nothing inconvenient emerged to complicate the sale. Miss Marple didn't press him. She didn't need to. His discomfort was loud enough without words, and when his mother mentioned the sealed room and the disputed inheritance, his hand trembled so badly that his tea sloshed over the rim of his cup. For a man whose future hung so precariously, the past was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Then there was the historian, a guest no one had truly invited yet who had somehow arrived at exactly the right moment. They were polite, self-effacing, and disarmingly knowledgeable about Hawthorne Hall's history, from architectural quirks to forgotten scandals. It was their interest in the secret room, however, that drew Miss Marple's attention. Too pointed, too prepared, as though their arrival was no coincidence at all. When asked how they came to know of the party, the answer was charmingly vague, full of literary research and passing curiosity. But Miss Marple noticed the small things, the way they avoided meeting Lady Harrowby's eyes, the flicker of recognition when the trunk was mentioned, and the sudden tension when the missing heir was brought up over scones. It was the look of someone who wasn't merely a researcher, but someone with skin in the game. Perhaps a descendant, perhaps a keeper of a family secret they could no longer contain. The housekeeper, by contrast, was a woman whose silence spoke louder than speech. Miss Marple had encountered her type before, loyal beyond sense, with secrets stitched into the fabric of her apron. Her voice was soft, her answers practiced. But Miss Marple saw the flickers of truth peeking through the cracks of rehearsed silence. The housekeeper had served the Harrowbys for decades, her family before her serving generations past, and with service came knowledge. Who crept where after midnight, whose letters were burned unread, and whose child was spirited away before the village could gossip. When Miss Marple gently remarked how houses remember what people forget, the housekeeper's hands trembled just once, barely a flicker, but enough for a keen eye to notice. Whatever the Harrowbys had buried, the housekeeper had buried it with them. And loyalty, Miss Marple knew, could be the most dangerous motive of all. Later, when the guests drifted apart, and Miss Marple wandered the West Wing alone, her mind replayed the afternoon's conversations, the silences, the glances, the half-truths smothered in polite smiles. She barely heard the step behind her. The shove was sudden, a hard, purposeful thrust between her shoulder blades, sending her sprawling down the narrow staircase. Pain blossomed across her hip and elbow, but it was the message that hurt more than the fall. This was not an accident. This was a warning. Bruised and breathless, Miss Marple allowed herself precisely 3 minutes to recover before rising, slow, steady, and utterly undeterred. A warning, after all, was merely proof that one was getting close. She had known from the start that this was no idle family scandal. But now, with the scent of fear thick in the air and the taste of danger sharp in her mouth, she knew with absolute certainty whatever lay hidden in Hawthorne Hall was worth killing for, and someone intended to ensure it stayed hidden forever. The morning after her fall, Miss Marple sat with her ankle propped on a cushion, the ache in her hip sharp with every movement. Yet pain, she often reflected, was no excuse for idleness. If anything, it sharpened the mind. When the house had settled into its usual rhythms, nervous whispers in the kitchen, forced politeness in the parlor, she rose, carefully but with purpose, and made her way back to the secret room. What had begun as a family curiosity had now drawn blood, and if someone was willing to push an old woman down the stairs to keep a secret, then that secret was surely worth uncovering. Her hands trembled only slightly as she touched the lid of the trunk once more. She was not afraid. She had learned long ago that truth had a way of waiting patiently for those who were willing to find it. This time Miss Marple examined the trunk with purpose. Not the surface treasures, the pearls, the letters, the crumbling book, but the trunk itself, its construction, its lining, the places where wood met leather just a shade too neatly. It was the sound that gave it away, a faint hollow tap when her knuckles passed over a section near the bottom. A soft breath of satisfaction escaped her lips. False bottoms were rarely placed for convenience. They existed to hide the inconvenient. A gentle probe with her knitting needle loosened the seam, and with the care of a woman accustomed to unearthing delicate truths, she lifted the false panel free. Nestled within was a small oilcloth bundle, tied with a frayed ribbon, its surface stained with age and something darker. Someone had gone to great lengths to preserve its contents, and someone else had prayed it would never be found. The letter inside was written in a fine hand, careful, undeliberate, dated more than a century ago. It opened with a phrase Miss Marple had seen before. "This is a record of my own voluntary confession, to be read in the event of my untimely death." There was no tremor of emotion in the words, no ink blot where a shaking hand had faltered. It was too neat, too prepared, more a legal formality than a guilty soul unburdening itself. The confession detailed a crime of passion, a sudden quarrel in the secret room, a blow struck in anger, and a body disposed of beneath the very floor where Miss Marple now stood. But the language troubled her. There were too many flourishes, too many explanations offered before anyone had the chance to ask. It was not the voice of a broken heart. It was the voice of a lawyer, closing every door before it could be opened. And nowhere, Miss Marple noticed, was the victim named. It was that omission which rang the loudest. A confession so thorough, so comprehensive, yet the one fact that should have been central, who had died, was left suspiciously vague. Not an accident, not forgetfulness, a deliberate absence, designed to allow for flexibility should inconvenient facts come to light. This was not a true confession. It was a script, carefully crafted to steer suspicion in a chosen direction, while leaving enough ambiguity to shift the story if needed. Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the paper, her mind already unspooling the threads. In her experience, people who committed crimes of passion rarely left behind letters written with such legal precision. This was not the work of a guilty conscience. This was the work of a guilty mind, playing a very long game. The confession, it seemed, had a villain ready-made, a servant, unnamed but described in terms designed to plant suspicion firmly in the mind of the reader, a man of poor character, prone to theft and drink, with a violent temper. It was a story too perfect, the kind whispered in servants' halls to explain why certain families had changed their staff so abruptly. Miss Marple's lips pursed in quiet disapproval. She had spent a lifetime observing the world's view of servants, blamed when convenient, invisible when not. She had also spent a lifetime knowing better. Servants, in her experience, were far too practical to involve themselves in family feuds. They knew when to turn a blind eye, when to sweep unpleasantness under the carpet, and when to leave well enough alone. This was not a servant's crime. This was a family's crime, carefully dressed up to look like something simpler, something beneath the notice of polite society. Later, in the quiet of her room, Miss Marple laid the confession beside her notes, tracing the timeline with gentle fingers. The elopement, the disputed heir, the sealed room, the murdered guest downstairs. It was no longer a series of separate incidents. It was a pattern, stitched together by fear, greed, and guilt. Whoever had written the confession had known enough to weave fact into fiction, preserving just enough truth to make the lies believable. But they had not counted on the village memory, nor on the quiet persistence of an elderly lady who saw human nature more clearly than most ever dared. The missing heir, Miss Marple suspected, was not missing at all. They had always been here, part of the house's fabric, as much a part of Hawthorne Hall as the portraits and the creaking stairs. And now, with the sealed room open and the past leaking through every crack, someone was willing to kill again to ensure the truth stayed buried. Miss Marple folded her notes neatly. The story was not over yet, but for the first time she knew where to look next. The vicarage, like so many in English villages, was a place where nothing ever seemed to happen. And yet, everything had happened there at one time or another. Over tea served in china cups that had seen better days, Miss Marple listened with the sort of gentle attentiveness that encouraged confidences. The vicar's wife, a woman with a talent for unearthing family skeletons beneath the guise of innocent gossip, was only too delighted to oblige. With every pour of tea and every offer of another scone, she peeled back the polite veneer that covered the Harrowby's history, until the conversation resembled an archaeological dig, layer upon layer of resentments, misalliances, and quietly vicious scandals. The sealed room, she confided in a hushed tone, had been a subject of whispered fascination for generations. The village, after all, never forgets. There had always been talk of letters hidden there, of promises broken and debts unpaid, and most of all, of secrets best left undisturbed. Miss Marple merely smiled her soft, distracted smile, the one she used whenever people mistook her for a harmless old dear. In her experience, villages always knew more than they realized. They simply needed the right person to stitch their fragments together. It was the vicar's wife who introduced the matter of the will, not deliberately, but the way such things always emerge in conversations filled with too much history and too little discretion. There had been a dispute years ago, when the old Harrowby patriarch died. A last-minute amendment, tucked into the back of the family Bible, had shifted the inheritance, a change that benefited one branch of the family and disinherited another, igniting a feud that still flickered beneath every village fete and church service. The amendment itself, she explained, were set to reference the secret room, tying its contents to the legitimacy of the revised will. If the trunk within contained what the amendment claimed, documents proving a certain marriage never took place, or that an heir was illegitimate, the entire inheritance could be overturned. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. The law, she thought, was often far messier than crime. For crime, at least, is usually personal. But inheritance and honor, those were wounds that festered across generations. It was a nursery rhyme of all things that tugged at Miss Marple's memory, something she had heard in passing at the hall, hummed under the housekeeper's breath while tea was served or fires were laid. Miss Marple, with her quiet precision, repeated the fragment she could recall, and the vicar's wife's face lit with recognition. The rhyme, it seemed, was a favorite of the old nanny, a woman long since retired, but one whose memory held far more than bedtime songs. The nanny, it was said, knew the true story of the secret room. She had served through scandal and silence, through the sealing of the door and the burial of certain memories, her own lips sealed by loyalty, fear, or perhaps something closer to guilt. Miss Marple's mind ticked quietly forward. Nursery rhymes, after all, were not just for children. They were often codes, meant to remind, to conceal, and sometimes to warn. Before Miss Marple could arrange to speak with the now elderly nanny, news arrived that she had vanished, gone missing overnight, leaving her small cottage empty, and her fate unknown. But there was a note, tucked neatly beneath a teapot on the kitchen table, written in a hand that trembled with age, but retained its clarity. The note contained only the rhyme, the same half-forgotten lullaby, with one line underlined twice. Miss Marple read it aloud, her voice soft but steady. "Where the key lies cold and deep, the harrow heart must secrets keep." It was, she thought, a message left not just for her but for the house itself, a parting gift from someone who knew they would not live long enough to see the truth spoken aloud. After tea, Miss Marple took a solitary walk back toward Hawthorne Hall, her mind turning the rhyme over and over, like a stone in the hand. "Where the key lies cold and deep." The phrasing was curious, not metaphorical but literal. A key, cold from disuse, hidden in some forgotten depth. Not a key to a door, she suspected, but a key to the truth. Perhaps something buried in the very structure of the room itself. The rhyme was not just a warning, it was a map, left behind by someone who could not speak the truth outright, but who had woven it into a child's lullaby, trusting that someday someone would listen closely enough to hear what lay beneath the melody. Miss Marple paused at the gates of the hall, her gaze drifting toward the west wing. Whoever had sealed that room had done so with the intention of leaving no way back. But someone else, the nanny, perhaps the vanished heir, had left a door open, hidden in plain sight. The past, Miss Marple thought, was never as silent as people wished it to be. And once a nursery rhyme began to sing again, there was no silencing it. They gathered in the drawing room once more, the Harrowbys, the guests, the staff, some still in morning black, others in the brittle calm that follows too much excitement. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her smile gentle but unreadable. To the untrained eye, she might have seemed a pleasant old lady, pleased to be of service. But those who had lived long enough in St. Mary Mead would have recognized that the particular set of her shoulders, the quiet confidence of a woman who had already solved the puzzle. She offered no accusations, asked for no confessions. Instead, she simply began to tell a story that had started more than a century ago, But that had ended only the night before. It began, Miss Marple explained, with a child's game. The accidental discovery of a secret room, long thought lost to memory. That discovery, harmless enough in itself, set everything into motion. The trunk, the letters, the old brooch gone missing. Each of these was a piece of a much older crime, one that had been carefully concealed beneath layers of family legend. The victim, Miss Marple revealed, had stumbled too far into the truth. A chance remark overheard at the garden party, a fleeting glimpse of a document inside the trunk, and suddenly they had realized that the history of Hawthorne Hall was not just scandalous, it was criminal. They had crept back to the secret room that night, hoping to confirm their suspicions. But they were not alone. Someone followed them, someone who knew that if the wrong paper came to light, their own comfortable inheritance would collapse like a house of cards. Miss Marple held the room with quiet authority as she explained what the victim had found. A forgery, expertly done, tucked among the genuine family papers. The forgery rewrote the terms of inheritance, ensuring that the estate would pass to the very person who had the most to gain from concealing the truth. It was not just a trick of pen and ink, it was a crime. The victim had intended to expose the forgery, perhaps even to confront the family. But they never had the chance. The killer struck first, using the Harrowby silk scarf, not for its convenience but for its symbolism. This was not merely a murder for gain. It was a warning to anyone who might dig too deep into the rotting foundations of Hawthorne Hall. Miss Marple's voice softened, not with pity, but with the weariness of someone who had seen such things too often. The killer, she said, was not a stranger, not a wandering thief. It was a Harrowby, raised in the house, fed on its stories, and bound to its legacy. It was they who had altered the will years earlier, ensuring their own inheritance at the cost of another branch of the family. The secret room, far from being a curiosity, had become a threat, for within its walls lay the original, unaltered will, a document that would have unraveled everything. When the room was opened once more, the killer had no choice. They followed the victim into the library that night, silk scarf in hand, and ensured that silence was preserved, at any cost. The past, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely truly buried. It only waited for the right or wrong moment to surface. The murder itself, Miss Marple explained, was not the start of the story. It was the final act in a tragedy set in motion decades before, when a young Harrowby daughter fled the house in shame, her love affair deemed unworthy by her family's cold standards. That elopement, that forbidden romance, had triggered the feud, the sealing of the room, and ultimately, the forging of the will. One crime gave birth to another, until every generation was burdened with secrets they could neither face nor confess. The silk scarf that had ended one life was the same woven thread that had choked the family for a century. A family as so determined to preserve its legacy that it had, over time, destroyed it from within. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but there was no mistaking the finality in her words. "Houses remember," she said, "and so do villages." In the end, it was not just justice served, but memory restored. The police, summoned quietly after the gathering, led the killer away with little fanfare. There were no shouted accusations, no dramatic collapse, only the soft tread of footsteps on ancient floors, and the creak of a door closing on one more Harrowby secret. Miss Marple accepted a final cup of tea exchanging polite farewells with Lady Harrowby, whose face was lined not only with grief, but with the sudden crushing weight of truth. Justice, Miss Marple knew, was rarely satisfying. It was not the tidy ending of novels, nor the triumphant unmasking one saw in plays. It was quieter, heavier, a reminder that human folly was not a crime to be solved, but a flaw to be endured. Before leaving, Miss Marple stood once more at the threshold of the secret room. The air was cooler here, as though the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for so long. The room, she thought, had been a witness to love, betrayal, and murder. A place where the human heart had unraveled itself, stitch by stitch. Justice had come, at last, but justice, Miss Marple knew, was only ever part of the story. The rest, the sorrow, the regret, the price of pride, that belonged to the house now. And houses, after all, remember everything. And so, Hawthorne Hall closes its doors once more, its secrets no longer hidden, but perhaps not entirely at rest. What began with a child's innocent discovery led to revelations that stretched across generations, proving that in houses like these, the walls do more than hold up ceilings. They hold memories, some whispered, some buried, and some, it seems, simply waiting for the right moment to step back into the light. There's something quietly haunting, isn't there? The way a single secret concealed for the sake of family honor can shape the fate of so many lives to come. Pride, fear, loyalty, all those very human impulses became the architects of tragedy, one brick at a time. And yet, that's the curious thing about the past. You can seal a door, hide a trunk, even forge a will, but the truth has a habit of finding its way through the cracks. Sometimes in the form of a stray letter, sometimes through the memory of a half-forgotten nursery rhyme, and sometimes through the quiet persistence of a seemingly harmless. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think.